welcome everybody. My name is David Goodhart. I am a journalist. I work part-time at the think tank Policy Exchange, and I have just written a book called The Road to Somewhere about the value divides in British society. But we're here today to talk more about Chris's book, Chris Renwick, who has just written a book called Bread for All about the deep history of the welfare state. But obviously we want, and Chris will reflect briefly on that history, but obviously we want to bring it up to date and talk about what that history means for the structure of the welfare state today, and the whole big story around welfare reform and the direction the welfare state will go in years to come. So Chris, why don't you start by giving a brief summary of your book?
Thanks. Okay, so the book, as David says, it is a deep history, and it's a deep history in the sense that most people, when they come to talk about the welfare state, start in 1945 and work forwards up to the present day. But what I do in the book is I take 1945 to 1948 as the end point. The Attlee government being the endpoint and the enacting of a history of about 150 years before that. And I make an argument about that history, and there are, I suppose, a few key points to make. The first is that I argue that the welfare state is fundamentally, in its British incarnation, a liberal construction. And it's meant to achieve liberal aims, not socialist aims, and that this is an important lesson that we need to learn and to think about when it comes to thinking about welfare. The second is that getting away from, we tend to get away from realising that, or rather sort of fixate on a narrow set of ideas when we forget about the fact that welfare, when we sort of tend to think of it as being kind of unemployment benefits and things like this, actually exists in the context of a much bigger economic strategy, a kind of macroeconomic strategy in particular. And so we need to talk about, well, what's the economic strategy that's supposed to go with rules and regulations around benefits. And I suppose the third, which is one that I kind of really only hint at in the book, but I've written about in a Guardian long read and other things like that, which is that effective stewardship of the welfare state is essential for maintaining broad popular support for liberal economics. And if you don't do that, the broad popular support for liberal economics will disappear, and then we have a problem.
Good. Okay. Well, I have to admit I haven't read the book, but I
you don't have to read it. Just buy it.
Right. Okay. Well, I'll try. I'll do that if you buy mine. I did read the long read in the Guardian, and I was glad to see that you helped to the further unravelling of the myth that the welfare state began in 1945 and it was all a Labour creation. And your hints that one of the great losses in the welfare state of the last few generations has been the move away from a largely contributory system to a mainly means-tested system, such that everybody now feels the welfare state doesn't work for them. I mean, people think it's either, at the same time, indeed, it's either miserly, the huge focus on the draconian work rules, the Ken Loach film and all of that, the feeling that it's become very unfair to poor people, and yet the fact that actually we continue to spend more and more and more on welfare. I mean, that the proportion of social security, sort of strict welfare, social security spending is now 14%. Is it of GDP or of public spending? I can't remember, but it's 14%. And in the kind of corporatist social democratic heyday of the mid-70s, it was only 7%. We now spend 30 billion on tax credits, the equivalent of tax credits. Back in 1990, we only spent 7 billion. Housing benefit, we spend 7 billion in 1990. Again, we now spend 25 billion. Disability, we spent 15 billion. Back in 1990, we now spend 40 billion. The welfare state remains extremely costly. It's also highly redistributive, and yet no one seems to think that it's working very well. I think partly because we have shifted from well, we're still risk pooling in the sense that it all comes from general taxation, but nobody feels very happy with it. There was a slight. You were writing for the Guardian, so there was a sort of slight leftist tinge in what you were saying about, the unravelling of the welfare state. This is one of the great political myths of our time. The welfare state is not unravelling in the slightest. I mean, there has been a pause, a kind of austerity-led pause. We've had a welfare cap, that's true, but we still spend huge amounts more than we spent even 20 years ago. So please withdraw this concept of unravelling, or make it more subtle, because it certainly isn't true in absolute terms.
Okay, so I'm not going to withdraw that. Here's my explanation as to why. I agree that you're absolutely right, that the idea that it is unravelling when judged about the amount of money that we are prepared to spend on the welfare state is something that isn't coming back. But the reason that I think it's unravelling is because we need to judge the welfare state not in terms of the money that we hand over essentially to the destitute, which is what increasingly these things become. We need to think about, well, what I try to argue, and the reason that I see it as being a fundamentally liberal in character, is thinking about how is it that we all benefit from the spending of welfare money properly, broadly construed. Now, let me explain that with a story, a personal story. We all have audiences in mind when we write books, and we say things, and we try to explain our arguments. And my audience that I had in mind was my dad. Now, my dad is a taxi driver in London. Some of you may have been at some point trapped in the back of his cab as he explains to you exactly what's wrong with the world. But my point here is that my dad left school when he was 15. He's worked as a taxi driver all of his life. And if you ask him about his work, he'll tell you that taxi driving is not necessarily the most highly sort of intellectually kind of demanding job in the world. But if you go out there and you do it, and you work hard, he's 68, and this morning he went out at 3 o'clock in the morning to go to work, and he's been doing that for 45 years now. If you do that, then you would in the past have been able to buy a house. He bought that house with my mum, and has lived in it for 30 years. But the reason that he was able to buy that house was part of a wider strategy of the provision of housing. I mean, the provision of housing is absolutely key to the history of the welfare state. And in many ways, there are people who argue that the kind of pulling of the thread of housing is something that's kind of started the unravelling that I was talking about, which is kind of going back to a world of low incomes, interrupted incomes, not being able to buy housing and things like that. And I think that that's the unravelling, and that's the thing that's not delivering, and the welfare state is absolutely part of it.
Well, yes and no. I mean, you sort of changed the subject onto housing policy, and I think you're right. I mean, actually, perhaps you're right. The best welfare policy we could have at the moment in this, because I mean, I think so many of the problems with welfare, as more narrowly defined, are intractable. I mean, we make demands on the welfare state that are really impossible to deliver. We want it to deliver, relatively generous security for people, either when accidents happen, or when they're in transition between jobs, or when they're stuck in poverty, or when they're very old, or whatever. We also want it not to undermine work incentives or individual responsibility, and want it to be not too expensive. And those things are very, very difficult to deliver together. And I mean, actually, yes, it would be good to move back to a more contributory system, but it's going to be extremely difficult to do. I think there are even symbolic things that you could do that people would be very happy with in that area. Like, if you have a long record of payment into the system, you should not have to go through all of the hoops and go to all of the meetings if you lose your job, the people who have shorter records, say if you have a work record of more than 5 years, you don't have to go to any meetings at all for 6 months, or something that just recognises the fact that you have contributed and other people have not. And there are a few other things you can do in that area, but essentially, I mean, we've got universal credit coming down. They're already being unrolled, and I think it's trying with some difficulty, I think, probably to make the work incentives slightly better, to make the system a bit more simple. Now, there are going to be, there are already warnings in the newspapers about one of the big problems here is the fact that people have to wait 6 weeks before they get any payments at all on universal credit, and that could, people have been warning this could be one of the next big political bombs to blow up under this government. And I hope somebody up there is looking at this, because it'd be a shame if that did happen. But I think that essentially we're talking about tinkering here. We're about tinkering on the edges of a very big and expensive and difficult to reform system. So in that sense, I think you're absolutely right that the kind of easier hits are outside the welfare system as narrowly defined in welfare, perhaps in family policy too. I mean, I do think we have remarkably little support for the family in this country in the tax system. Almost all other advanced rich countries like ours have some sort of fiscal support for the family, and many countries also. I mean, our family policy, our family and gender policy is essentially about allowing people, making it easier for people to spend as little time as possible with their families. And I think so many of our, the kind of the shrinkage of the private realm lies behind so many other of our big social problems. Social care is partly a crisis of family obligations, that we don't feel the same obligations to our elders that we did do some generations ago. There are things outside the social security system, as it were, that could help to reform the system better than reforming the social security system itself.
Yeah, but I think if you talk about universal credit in the report that I was reading this morning, and this I suppose is why I'm suggesting we need to think about welfare as being as not falling back onto a particular sort of subsection almost of the unemployed, is that 40% of people affected by the universal credit potential debacle are in work. When we talk about the welfare state, we need to talk about people who are in work, not just people who are out of work. And I think that's conceiving it in this kind of broader sense is absolutely essential for, I think, both for understanding what it is that the welfare state does and also understanding, I think people in general have a much more sophisticated understanding of the welfare state and what it does than we often give them credit for. And a large amount of disillusionment in the past 4 or 5 years, I think, stems from that much more sophisticated understanding of what it does and what it can do and what it can deliver.
Yeah, but I think, what you're talking about is the opposite of an unravelling. You're talking about an expansion of the welfare state into many more areas of our lives. I mean, the fact that, as you say, so many people in work are affected by the whole tax credit system. I mean, the tax credit system, barely existed until 15 years ago. These are huge extra dimensions and we can't go on like this. I think what will probably happen. There is this bigger question of, would we as a society create the welfare state today in the way that it was created around the time of the First World War and then after the Second World War? I think the answer to that is probably no, actually, because we don't have the degree of society is still in some ways a kind of moral community, but we do not have the kind of instinctive social solidarity that we had 50 or 100 years ago, and for perfectly sort of good reasons in a way. We are much more diverse morally, ethnically, religiously, in all sorts of different ways. And we have come to see certain aspects of welfare, not the whole thing, but certain aspects of welfare as associated with people who we no longer know, as it were, the other, as the left always like to describe it. And I think there is something in that, and there isn't the same sort of feeling that we're all in the same boat, or that that could be me tomorrow. And I think that is just unavoidable now. But it does mean that I think we are going to move in the future. The kind of template for welfare and social support more generally is going to be the current pension system. The current pension system, in which you have a relatively decent state floor, and then you have people encouraged through the tax system partly to provide for themselves when they want more than that. Now, one could apply that across a whole range of things. Many countries in the world, America in particular, apply that to unemployment benefit. You know, there is basic unemployment benefit, and then on top of that, you get tax breaks for insuring yourself. I don't think that should be considered a taboo idea at all, and I think it's probably where we will go.
Yeah, I mean, I think to begin with where you started there, I think that this idea of a community is important when it comes to thinking about the welfare state, in the sense of the community exists when people feel that they get something out of it. And there are too many people now who do not feel that they get something out of it, understood as a kind of broader system, and do not feel that the system as a whole is working for them. And if they feel that the system as a whole is not working for them, then they will not just reject, embrace the idea, well, we need to cut back on welfare as an overall expenditure. They will begin to embrace other ideas to do with essentially paying for everything, to go back to your contributing point, paying for everything out of general taxation, which is what Jeremy Corbyn wants to do, right? Pay for everything out of general taxation. I do not believe that most people in this country actually want to pay for everything out of general taxation, and I think that a contributing model is actually something that we need to look more at. We need to re-examine national insurance. I mean, I spent quite a lot of time looking at this, and I'm not entirely sure I understand quite how national insurance really works anymore. And I think that's actually quite important, because when national insurance was first introduced, it was a highly regressive tax. It was flat rate for flat rate contributions and flat rate benefits. But people liked it because it was simple to understand, and you understand what you could get out and what you put in at various points in time. And to take the welfare state understood broadly as the areas of our kind of economic and social life in which the state not just participates but looks to shape. There are in terms of jobs, housing, all these kinds of areas, too many people in this country who feel that they don't get anything out of it and are therefore interested in solutions, or at least prepared to vote for solutions that do not involve liberal economic means of delivering. And I think that's a real worry.
Well, I mean, what you're saying in a sense is that we should go back to a more kind of Bismarckian insurance-based model, which is what our system was more like in the 40s and 50s, where you paid in a certain amount through your national insurance and you were then entitled to certain benefits. And of course, this is much more like the system they have throughout continental Europe, in France and Germany and elsewhere. And I think that is probably the direction we are headed in, and probably should be headed in, including in the health system. I mean, clearly the National Health Service, as it currently is, cannot go on just being funded through general taxation. Given the demands on the system, we're going to have to change the way that it is funded, partly, and that seems the obvious way. I mean, obviously the insurance should be compulsory. These systems seem to work perfectly well in societies that are in many ways more egalitarian, have higher levels of social provision than we do. So there's no reason to be frightened about it. Although, of course, in the case of the NHS, it is the national religion, and reforming it is going to be incredibly difficult. But that's a whole other area. All right. Well, there you are. Thank you.